Fine.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank the association for being kind enough to invite me. And I also want to invoke the use of Cleo and Psyche. Cleo Psyche being the name of one of the magazines. I would like to sing the wrath of Smirdyakov and Ivan Karamazov and Dmitri, and the love of Alyosha. I think we should never start anything without invoking the muse. The tradition started by Homer, and I think one that we can very wisely pursue and continue. My name is Robinson Lilienthal. I'm Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Rutgers, and I'm a member of the Object Relations Institute. I would also like to dedicate this to the God of Onions. I don't want to shame anybody, so I'm not going to ask who's recently read the Brothers Karamazov. I would, though, however, encourage all of you, if my talk accomplishes nothing else, it would be to get you to go out and read it or reread it again. And I would encourage you to get the Norton Critical Edition. It's got wonderful essays in the back, it's got footnotes, chronology, all kinds of things. It's the second edition. I've been reading Dostoevsky since high school. I discovered Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud and Dostoevsky all just about at the same time, and they've haunted me ever since. And now, just 70, in fact, today is my 70th birthday.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday.
So, for more than 50 years, I have been wrestling with some of these ideas and these thoughts. I think it was Oscar Wilde who once said that if a book isn't worth rereading twice, it's not worth reading once. So I've gone through at least 4 copies of the Brothers K in my life already. This is the only one that's still intact and not so marked up that I can't read it. This is my second critical edition. You all know, of course, that Dostoevsky is one of the greatest writers that the world has ever seen. He's not just a great Russian writer, he's a great writer. And he's also, I think, one of the most profound, one of the most psychologically insightful. But he's also a philosopher and a theologian, and as I would call him, a physician of culture. He saw himself explicitly in his letters and in Diary of a Writer as addressing what he saw as the critical cultural illness of Russia, with the destruction of the family, the rise of revolution, the rise of assassination of the nihilists that eventually gave us the Bolshevik Revolution. And he saw his writings as explicitly addressing that crisis. And he addresses the symptomology, the diagnosis, and the prognosis, and the therapy. And like Nietzsche and like Freud, he was a self-avowed cultural physician. And he saw his writings as therapeutic. He meant these great novels of his to have a cultural impact. He wasn't doing this to make a living. He wasn't doing it to entertain. He wasn't doing it like Dickens to support 2 families. And he had long given up gambling, so he wasn't doing it to go to V-Spot and gamble. His characters are unbelievably vivid. They're so labile, they're so changeable. Furthermore, they develop and grow. There's a way in which I don't think hardly any novelist, except possibly Tolstoy, or maybe Stendhal, has ever presented the growth and development and maturation of character. And their changeability, their ambivalence, their ambiguities. I love you because I hate you because I love you. What? Well, no wonder teenagers love Dostoevsky. But he's also profoundly serious and thoughtful. I mean, as much as his novels read like 19th century serialized soap operas, which they were, they're also profoundly serious and thoughtful. And their intention is to make us think. I don't want to rehearse his biography, that could take. Joseph Frank has devoted 5 huge volumes already to this. There's a one big fat paperback condensed version that you go pick up at the Strand. I was just rereading it again last night. It's a mammoth work, a lifetime. But he was born in 1821 and he died in 1881. There are 2 traumatic events in his life that we should briefly mention. At the age of 18, his father, who was a retired medical officer, was murdered by his serfs. The father was rather brutal, lived by himself, and alienated his wife and his children. He was out in a small farm of his, and he was found smothered to death. And at least Dostoevsky and his family came to believe that he'd been murdered by his serfs. He may also, of course, have had intimate relations with some of the women serfs. Hardly an unknown phenomenon. That was his first, he was only 18 at the time. So this was, I think, a major trauma. And of course it foreshadows, novelistically, the murder of Fyodor Karamazov. The other great trauma in his life was when he was 28. He joined a revolutionary organization, hardly military, hardly violent, but they had planned to acquire a printing press which was supposed to print out revolutionary material, which consisted of the equality of men and women, the freeing of the serfs, utilitarianism, all kinds of really radical stuff from the point of view, of course, of Tsarist Russia. His group was arrested and they were condemned to death. There was a mock execution where he was actually led in front of a firing squad. And this apparently was at the behest of the Tsar. And at the last moment, he was given a 4-year sentence of hard labor in Siberia. According to Joseph Frank, as a result of that, he suffered his first serious epileptic seizure. He spent 4 years in hard labor, which resulted then in a novel. He was finally able to return in 1859 to St. Petersburg, where he marries his guardian angel, Anna, without whom we would not have the great novels. She kept him from gambling, literally locked him in his room. She was a stenographer, and she would pick up the stray manuscripts all over the floor every night and take them into her room and transcribe them into legible documents. She dealt with his publishers. She kept him from meeting friends who kept visiting him all the time where he was giving away all of his money. And we would not have had the Possessed, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, and the Brothers Karamazov without her. Fyodor Karamazov is a really nasty piece of work. And the extent of his being nasty is proven by the title of one of the chapters where they go to visit the monastery. And the chapter is called, "Why is Such a Man Alive?" He's a rapist. He rapes Smirniakov's mother, who's the village idiot. He abused and abandoned all 4 of his children, 3 of whom were legitimate, 1 of whom was illegitimate. People tend to forget that there's 4 brothers and not just 3. He steals money from his second son, Dmitri. He's an abusive father. He's a buffoon. And he's in direct competition with his son, Dmitri, for the love of Grushenka. He lets it be known that he has 10,000 rubles ready to give her, or 20, if she would come to visit him. And Dmitri, who's also in love with Grushenka, is convinced that that 20,000 rubles is the money that he stole, or his father stole, from his inheritance, which is probably true. This whole story is really about the destruction of the Russian family. This is where Dostoevsky is playing the symptoms and the diagnosis of Russian society, trying to understand why all these violent revolutionaries are emerging. He's a Catholic, Theodore. Interesting that he gave this father his own name, just as he gave his epilepsy to Smerdyakov. So first we have the father, who I would call a typical laist father. Now, some of you may be familiar with the idea of the laist complex. The burden of my whole argument is that we have a laist father here who's out to abuse and use his children. Very much the way Laius, the father of Oedipus, abandons him on the mountainside. It should have been called a Laius complex. No son, no little infant wants to kill daddy. He just wants mommy. Mm-hmm. The only people who ever kill people are fathers killing sons. I mean, throughout human history, as Martin Bergman points out in The Shadow of Moloch, entire priesthoods have been dedicated to the sacrifice of sons. And of course, Abraham and Isaac is the example best known to us. But Moloch from Carthage in North Africa was far, far bloodier. When archaeologists finally dug up those cemeteries, they found thousands of remnants of children that had been sacrificed to the god Moloch. So he's a typical laist father who's provoking his children to violence. And in a way, the burden in my position here is that these four sons colluded consciously and unconsciously with the murder of their father. Now, the oldest son is Ivan. As one of my professors corrected me years ago. But I said, we're in America. I'm not speaking Russian. So I'm going to say Ivan. Ivan is the intellectual. He represents the reasoning capacity and faculty. And he's been trained and educated in European concepts and is struggling probably more than anyone in the novel with the problem of God. But more importantly, the problem of evil. And more even specifically than that, the problem of the suffering of children. I mean, throughout this novel and throughout Dostoevsky's writings, we see him constantly wrestling with the problem of evil, of suffering, but specifically of children. And in the famous Rebellion chapter, chapter 5, Dostoevsky actually, from newspaper accounts, had been collecting hundreds of examples of horrible, horrible stories of abuse of children. We're talking prepubescent here, and most adolescent. And when somebody objected to him, when his publisher said, "You're making these up," Dostoevsky showed up in the office and handed them the folder of hundreds of examples taken from the newspaper. And it's clear that Dostoevsky has partitioned him out, parts of himself out, into these four brothers, including probably even the father. The gambling, the alcoholism. And this really is, I think, one of the most profound arguments against the existence of God. Dostoevsky believed that this novel, as presented through the character, I should say, Ivan's argument, is the most profound argument against God that's ever been produced by anybody, barring no one. And it's impossible to read that and Rebellion and then the Grand Inquisitor and not come away with profound questions and doubts, no matter how sincere or how deep your upbringing may have been. And you can't take refuge in some God of Spinoza. And that just won't do. You can't take, the idea that somehow this is the best of all possible worlds, although Leibniz, that isn't going to fly either in the face of the actual suffering of children. Now, of course, we, 100-something years later, have even a bigger problem, which is the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, and of course the Gulag Archipelago. How any survivor can come out of that, or for that matter, any Jew or Christian, or even Muslim, still believing in a benign, merciful, beneficent deity is, frankly, to me, inconceivable. But Dostoevsky's desperately trying to find a way to still hold on to some kind of meaningful relationship to God, and specifically to the Russian Christ, who, of course, Ivan is in rebellion against. He says that even if the suffering child were in some final moment of harmony to be able to forgive his tormentor or his murderer, he would still find that the price of harmony was too high. He says, I return my ticket. I don't doubt God, I just doubt the belief in this harmony. He colludes with Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is, of course, the illegitimate son. Raised, never left the house, sent to Moscow to become a cook, self-described lackey, used and abused by his father, made fun of, ignored by his three brothers, who all repudiate him, even though they know that their father is his father. Dmitri is the gallant officer. He's the romantic. He gambles, he drinks, he womanizes, but he's got a good heart. He's basically the product, again, of a dysfunctional family. Raised by a serf as a young child, allowed to run around naked, then finally rescued by his mother's family. He's in direct Oedipal conflict with his father. And in their first meeting, they practically come to blows in the monastery. And he clearly has the intent and will to kill his father. And it couldn't be more Oedipal. It couldn't be more Laius-Oedipal. We have then, of course, the saintly brother, Alyosha, who's come to this town. And by the way, the only one who's really ever there is Smerdyakov. The other three brothers just happen to all show up. Alyosha is studying with Father Zazim at the monastery. And he's very personable. Everybody likes him. Even his father gets along with him. He gets along with everybody else. And in the novel, he's the one who keeps connecting everybody with everybody else, passing messages back and forth. Every one of these characters will undergo a transformation. Finally, of course, we have Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is a figure almost out of Nietzsche called the pale criminal. He's full of resentment and bitterness. He knows that he could have become something better than a cook and a lackey. He knows that he's inherited the family's intelligence, but he's stuck. He's poor. He doesn't really want to just leave and go on the road. And He, of course, is the murderer. He's also the epileptic. He feigns an attack of epilepsy. And everyone in the novel knows about these attacks, which begin with a kind of aura around things, and then kind of come to a crescendo of a kind of ecstasy. And of course, being an epileptic himself, Dostoevsky probably gave one of the best clinical descriptions of epilepsy that anybody's ever found. But then, of course, the epileptic collapses into a state of unconsciousness. Smerdyakov implies to his brother Ivan that he has learned to know when one of these attacks is about to come. But he also hints that he's learned to fake it. And he tells his brother Ivan, if you go off to Moscow, maybe Dmitri will come and kill the old man. And Ivan says, let one insect destroy the other. He's also been teaching Smerdyakov that if there is no God, all things are permitted. Or maybe rather we should say, nothing is forbidden, including patricide. And it's clear that Dmitri is so enraged over being cheated by his father out of money, his inheritance, and his connection to his mother, and over Grushenka, who's the femme fatale of the novel, that he's ready to murder his father. And indeed, he does go to the house, and he does jump over the fence. And by some weird court, he's waiting to see if Grushenka is going to show up and get the 20,000 rubles. And he's in cahoots indirectly with Smerdyakov, who's supposed to tell him, hey, Dmitri, guess what? Grushenka is coming to visit your father. Uh-oh. Right? I mean, there's a degree of intensity that, again, only a Dostoevsky a la soap opera could possibly create. And you're right there with them. I mean, it's like watching literally a soap opera. There's a rivalry between the brothers, as inevitably there has to be. Ivan is jealous of Alyosha's social ability to get along with everybody, to be loved by everybody, to be so nice. And he sets out in a tavern to try to dissuade Alyosha from his religious belief. He tries to convert Alyosha to becoming an atheist. He even gets Alyosha to admit that if he lost his belief in God, he'd become a revolutionary socialist. Why? To save the suffering children. I mean, they agree with that, with each other about that. Alyosha probably resents the fact that Ivan is so smart and so intelligent and so clever and writes stories and wonderful, arguments and so on. The novel is full of these internal stories that Ivan has told. The Grand Inquisitor being the greatest. Dmitri is, of course, so obsessed with Grushenka and his money that he doesn't really have time to be too jealous of anybody. He figures that Ivan is a useless intellectual and his brother's just a God-besotted wannabe monk. The other brothers resent Dmitri because Dmitri's having such a good time. He's going out to all kinds of clubs and dances and gypsy playing and music and I guess the Russian equivalent of orgies, I don't know. I mean, Dostoevsky is a bit prudish. There is, as in no 19th century novel, there is no sex. We're British. No, in this case, we're Russian. So there's no sex, but it's implied. So there's sibling rivalry going on. The only one that really gets along with the father is Alyosha. Would you like a glass of water? But Alyosha knows how awful his father is. And when he makes fun of his surrogate father, Father Zazima, at the monastery, he himself is in a rage over the way his father, his biological father, abuses and mistreats the hospitality and the dignity of his surrogate father, Father Zazima. Alyosha does have one saving characteristic, and that is his memories of his mother in childhood. And this is a very important constant for him, for us psychologists or you psychologists. Dostoevsky he seemed to believe that if we have some good memories from our childhood, we can call upon them in times of crisis, and they strengthen us to becoming better human beings. And he throughout the novel, he's encouraging the characters to remember positive, and one of his arguments about abusing children is that it destroys their capacity for positive memories in the future. He seems to be constantly looking for a wholeness of knitting together the past, the present, and the future. And remembering positive things from your childhood seems to be a very important part of that. All the characters undergo a kind of death and rebirth, which is one of the most fascinating things about this novel. They all go through a profound death-like experience. Alyosha. Father Zazima dies, and all the brothers are thinking, oh, he's a saint, and his body will be preserved, even though it's summer. And slowly, as the smell of his decomposing body permeates the monastery, everybody's starting to wonder, was he really a saint? And what happened? And how come God isn't intervening? And Alyosha is caught up in that same kind of fanatic Christianity. And he's beginning to doubt whether or not Zazima really was a saintly figure and the teachings that he'd absorbed. He's so disturbed by this that when Radican, a fellow wannabe monk who's really just a careerist, Gershenka decides in her evilness she's going to seduce Alyosha. And she offers 25 rubles and a big bottle of champagne to Radican to bring Alyosha to her house. And Alyosha is so disturbed by the stink of the decomposing body of Father Zazima that he goes. And he sort of half knows what Gershenka, because she's got this reputation. Of course, she turns out to be pure as the driven snow, but that's another question. He shows up. They confront each other for the first time. And Gershenka is blown away by the sweetness and innocence of Alyosha. And Alyosha is blown away by her beauty and her deep innocence. And she tells him a story about a nasty old woman who never did anything nice or good to anybody. And when she dies, the devil is about to take her down into hell. And her guardian angel is desperately trying to find something nice that this old nasty lady did. It turned out once in her life she gave an onion to a passing peasant beggar. So the guardian angel tells this to God. So God says, all right, here's an onion. You go down to hell, you offer her that onion at one end to hold, you hold the other end and pull her up out of hell. And she started to come up out of the pits. And suddenly some of the other condemned souls are grabbing onto her legs. And she starts kicking at them. That's my onion! And at that moment, the onion breaks. And she goes back down into hell. And they're both so moved by this story. This is an ancient Russian peasant story. And the idea here is that even one good deed can save you. And that woman was just about to be saved until her true nature undid her. And if she had allowed them to hold on to her, her guardian angel would have pulled her out and them. That's why I call it, and it's called in the text, the God of Onions. Dostoevsky tries to find a balance ultimately between the radical, violent socialist movement and the crazy, fanatical Christians at the other end. They're united by a number of common elements. They're utopians, they're apocalyptic, messianic, and they're fanatics. They seem to be willing to sacrifice anybody in the present for some unnamed future. And we see this with the Nazis, we see it with the communists in Russia. We all know these people. They love humanity but hate people. They're out there picketing for everything, but they abuse their children. Dostoevsky managed in this novel to find a way to try to combine his commitment to suffering and his commitment to God at the same time. And he finds it in these small acts of kindness, not in grand gestures, which will lead to apocalyptic fundamental changes. He doesn't find it, just a couple more minutes and I'm almost finished, okay? He doesn't find it in revolutionary action. He finds it in these small moments of kindness. And as a final example of the transformation of various characters, I would refer to Ivan and Alyosha. Throughout the novel, Alyosha is attentive to these boys who live in the town. And when they fall to fighting and hurting each other, Alyosha intervenes. Meanwhile, Ivan is complaining about newspaper clippings of children being used and abused. But he never lifts a finger to actually help any child. Whereas Alyosha is out there actually trying to help real children in the real world, not in a newspaper clipping. Having finally realized that Smerdyakov committed the murder and that he helped instigate it, he's going to his third interview with Smerdyakov, and he meets a drunken peasant and pushes him aside into the snow, knowing that he'll probably freeze to death. After he leaves Smerdyakov, he suddenly realizes he sees that same peasant nearly frozen to death. He picks him up out of the snow, brings him to a tavern, gets a doctor, and takes care of him. And that's the only single humane act that Ivan commits in the entire novel. But we see him undergoing that transformation. I think towards the end of his life, Dostoevsky gave up the fantasy of apocalyptic change and instead advocated what I would call a prosaic Christianity. To show you how prophetic he was, and this is the last comment.
We have to stop because there's a meeting here.
A month later.
We have a meeting here
Yeah.
in 3 minutes. We have to set up.
I have 30 seconds.
Okay.
A month after he died, in February of 1881, in March of 1880, the Tsar of Russia was assassinated.
Wow.
And that opens up the door to the Kerensky and then the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Okay.